Good evening, everybody. I'm your host, Jack Remington of Jack Remington Political Analyst. Today is a tribute video to Mr. Walter Williams, who passed yesterday at the age of 84. So I want to read something from the Orange County Register. The article is titled, "Never Forget the Great Walter E. Williams." And it's by the entire editorial board of the Orange County Register. Walter Edward Williams, one of the world's greatest champions of liberty, passed away this week at the age of 84. His life and ideas will never be forgotten. Born in Philadelphia on March 21, 1936, and raised in the Richard Allen housing projects, Williams never allowed himself to be a victim of his circumstances. Williams always believed in the value of hard work and the fundamental promise of America. After being drafted into the military, Williams penned a letter to the President John F. Kennedy in 1963 calling out the rampant racism of the times and in the military itself. Quote, "Should Negroes be relieved of their service obligation will continue to defending and dying for empty promises of freedom and equality," he wrote. "Or should we demand human rights as our founding fathers did at the risk of being called extremists? I contend that we relieve ourselves of this oppression in a manner that is keeping with the great heritage of our nation." End of quote. After receiving his bachelor's degree in economics at California State University, Los Angeles, and ultimately his doctorate in economics from the University of California, Los Angeles, Williams went on to become a longtime professor of economics at George Mason University. His first book, The State Against Blacks, published in 1982, is as relevant as ever. In it, he presented his case that while racial discrimination and bigotry certainly exist, it is the rules of the game that account for many of the economic hardships, that account for many of the economic handicaps faced by blacks. Overregulation by the government, including laws like occupational and business licensing, zoning regulations, and the minimum wage, Williams argued, quote, "systematically discriminate against the employment and the advancement of people who are outsiders, latecomers, and poor in resources," end of quote. While it is fashionable among younger generations to condemn capitalism, Williams understood that capitalism is the greatest means for liberating people from poverty known to man. Quote, "Prior to capitalism, the way people amassed great wealth was by looting, plundering, and enslaving their fellow man," he said. "Capitalism made it possible to become wealthy by serving your fellow man." End of quote. Quote, "I am my private property and you are yours," he wrote. "Illegitimate, coercive, and non-voluntary intrusions on individuals," he argued, "are fundamentally immoral. Whether it's a criminal assaulting you physically or the state dictating what you can or can't do with your own life, Williams always put the dignity and integrity of the individual first and foremost. Though there will only be one Walter E. Williams, his ideas must endure forever." So I'm going to play a clip that I heard on the Mark Levin show last night that kind of illustrates the kind of thinking and how he took a very complex theme and made it so simple that it's like a life for dummies, as it were. Whenever I could, I always try to listen to Walter Williams' podcast. I try to listen to him on his speeches that he gave around the country and on the different videos from different top-tier YouTubers and other hosts. Enjoy this clip from Walter Williams. You're going to hear him on the Mark Levin show. He's an American treasure, and he didn't let circumstances stop him. He achieved despite the odds, and that's why I admire Walter E. Williams.
Dr. Walter Williams was on this radio program fairly often over the almost 20 years I've been on radio. When I started Life, Liberty, and Levin, the very first show in February 2018, I wanted Walter Williams on my show. And he came down from suburban Philadelphia. I wanted to have him on again, in June or July on TV, Mr. Producer, something like that. But he was on an oxygen machine, one of those portable oxygen machines that people use when they have emphysema. And so we decided we wouldn't do that. So I brought him on radio during the course of the Democrat Party riots in the streets to have him comment on it. You know, when I was a young teenager, I was instinctively a conservative because I didn't like authority that much. I didn't like people pushing me around. And Walter Williams, who from time to time would be on PBS with Milton Friedman and so forth, as was Thomas Sowell, but he wrote these beautiful columns. And I remember my dad and mom showing them to me and encouraging me to read them. We've lost an icon. People use that word a lot. We've lost a huge, huge presence in this society for those of us who believe in liberty and the Constitution and humanity of the individual. Walter Williams had a terrific sense of humor. He's very easygoing, but he was a fierce defender of liberty. Period. When he was young, he experienced a lot of racism. He grew up in Philadelphia, West Philadelphia, then North Philadelphia, and he and I used to talk about Philadelphia. I'm a Philadelphian myself. I think he lived for several decades in suburban Philadelphia, as I recall. I also remember Walter constantly with a cigarette in his hand. Those damnable cigarettes. You do what you want. I'm just saying. I've seen too much of it. The last time I saw him again was February 2018, the kickoff of Life, Liberty, and Levin. He was hilarious, easygoing. You don't have to prep him. I mean, he knew his topic. Liberty. That's what he cared about. Liberty. I said, you're a libertarian, kind of classical liberal. Would that be about right? He said, yeah, that's about right. You notice something about Walter Williams and his dear, close, almost lifelong friend, Thomas Sowell. They didn't become never-Trumpers. They were not never-Trumpers. They didn't agree with everything Donald Trump did. They didn't agree with everything he said and the way he said it. But they understood the nature of a republic, and they understood republicanism. I've had Thomas Sowell on my show, Life, Liberty, and Levin. I've had him on my radio show. I think it's very, very important that we listen to these iconic figures while they're with us. And now one of them's gone. And, you know, selfishly, personally, as I said when I first heard this, it was a kick in the gut because you go, oh, no. They say people are replaceable. They're not replaceable. He's irreplaceable. Milton Friedman's irreplaceable. William Rusher's irreplaceable. William Buckley's irreplaceable. We have people who feel like they fill their shoes today. They don't fill their shoes. Not even close. And Walter Williams will be missed. Right up to a few weeks before he passed away, and I suspect he knew the time was coming. I don't know, but breathing disorders, emphysema, I mean, you're suffocating. And here is his last column, which came out today for me, but for some people, I suppose, yesterday. This tragedy in black education is new. That was the title, dated December 1. Several years ago, Project Baltimore began an investigation of Baltimore's school system. What they found was an utter disgrace. In 19 of Baltimore's 39 high schools, out of 3,804 students, only 14 of them, or less than 1%, were proficient in math. In 13 of Baltimore's high schools, not a single student scored proficient in math. In 5 Baltimore City high schools, not a single student scored proficient in math or reading. And despite these academic deficiencies, about 70% of the students graduate and are conferred a high school diploma, a fraudulent high school diploma. Education was so important to him. Big believer in school choice. He said the Detroit Public Schools Community District scored the lowest in the nation compared to 26 other urban districts for reading and mathematics at the 4th and 8th grade levels. A recent video captures some of this miseducation in Milwaukee high schools. In 2 city high schools, only 1 student tested proficient in math. None are proficient in English. Yet the schools spent a full week learning about systemic racism and Black Lives Matter activism. By the way, he says, a November 19, 2020 Milwaukee Journal Sentinel article says, how many black teachers did you have? I've only had 2. And the article concludes, for future black students, that number needs to go up. New York City is one of many school systems in the United States set to roll out Black Lives Matter-themed lesson plans. According to the NYC Department of Education, teachers will delve into systemic racism, police brutality, and white privilege in their classrooms. Should we blame this education tragedy on racial discrimination or claim that it's a legacy of slavery? And then he quotes his dear friend Thomas Sowell, and I tell you, Walter Williams was so graceful, as is Thomas Sowell. These two are just unbelievable. Dr. Thomas Sowell's research in education, assumptions versus history, documents academic excellence at Baltimore's Frederick Douglass High School and others. The academic excellence occurred during the late 1800s to the mid-1900s, an era when blacks were much poorer than today, and faced gross racial discrimination. Frederick Douglass High School of yesteryear produced many distinguished alumni, such as Thurgood Marshall and Cab Calloway, and several judges, congressmen, and civil rights leaders. Federal Douglass High School was second in the nation in black PhDs among its alumni. Also in Souls Education, Assumptions versus History, is the story of Paul Laurence Dunbar. That is the story of Paul Laurence Dunbar High School, a black public school in Washington, D.C. as early as 1899. Its students scored higher on citywide tests than any of the city's white schools. From its founding in 1870 to 1955, most of its graduates went off to college. Dunbar's distinguished alumni include U.S. Senator Edward Brooke, physician Charles Drew, and during World War II, nearly a score of majors, 9 colonels, lieutenant colonels, and brigadier general. Today's Paul Laurence Dunbar and Frederick Douglass High Schools have material resources that would have been unimaginable to their predecessors. But having those resources have meant absolutely nothing in terms of academic achievement. If we accept the notion that rotten education is not preordained, then I wonder when the black community will demand an end to an education environment that condemns so many youngsters to mediocrity. You can bet the rent money that white liberals and high-income blacks would not begin to accept the kind of education for their children that most blacks receive. Walter Williams went on. The school climate, seldom discussed, plays a very important role in education. During the 2017-18 school year, there were an estimated 962,300 violent incidents, 476,100 nonviolent incidents in U.S. public schools nationwide. Schools with 1,000 or more students had at least one sworn law enforcement officer. About 90% of those law enforcement officers carry firearms. Aside from violence, there are many instances of outright disrespect for teachers. First and second graders telling teachers to shut the F up and calling teachers bees. Years ago, much of that behavior from young people that we see today would have never been tolerated. There was the vice principal's office where corporal punishment would be administered for gross infractions. If the kid was unwise enough to tell his parents what happened, he might get more punishment at home. Today, unfortunately, we have replaced practices that work with practices that sound good and caring. And we are witnessing the results. Dr. Walter Williams, final column. Professor of Economics at George Mason University, who will be remembered as long as I live on this program. And as I say, he was the first guest, the inaugural show of Life, Liberty, and Levin. And I'm going to interrupt what I was talking about earlier to play some of what he said. Now, I'll play some, and then we'll take a break, and I'll play some more. February 25, 2018. Cut 15, go.
How would you define liberty?
Well, I defined it as people being able to engage in peaceable, voluntary exchange without interference by others. And typically, down through mankind's history, liberty is not the normal state of affairs. That is, throughout mankind's history, he's been subject to arbitrary abuse and control by others. And so the amount of liberties that Americans have, and perhaps Western Europe as well, the amount of it is relatively rare in humankind. And I think that the danger that we face is that some historian, maybe 200 years from now, he might be writing, he says, well, look, the normal state of affairs has been arbitrary abuse and control by others. And there's this little tiny curiosity where a relatively few people had a large amount of liberty for a short amount of time, but it all went back to the normal state of affairs. That is arbitrary abuse and control by others.
Do you think liberty has the seeds of its own demise, that there's a paradox because people who don't support liberty or who are unwitting about liberty can still use liberty to destroy liberty.
Oh, that's absolutely right. That is, they can use liberty to destroy liberty. They can use if you look at totalitarians around the world, they always start out, they are for free speech. That is because they need free speech to get their foot in the door. But after their foot is in the door, they want to eliminate free speech. And you see this all over the country. You'll see this all over the world. And we're beginning to see it in the United States. That is, in Berkeley, that was the seed of the free speech movement. But now at Berkeley, they don't want any free speech whatsoever. So again, I think that we have to be very, very concerned because we're losing our liberty. And if you ask the question, which way are we moving, tiny steps at a time? Are we headed towards more personal liberty or towards more government control over our lives? It'd have to be unambiguously the latter.
So true, particularly over the last 12 months, when you see what governors have been doing and mayors have been doing. February 25, 2018, on the inaugural Life, Liberty, and Levin program, Cut 16, go.
You know, when I was about 20 years old, my father and I visited a senator by the name of Paul Laxalt from Nevada. He was very close to Ronald Reagan. And one of the things he said to me that has stuck with me ever since, every day Congress meets, he said, we lose a little bit of our liberty. Now, it wasn't supposed to be that way. Mm-hmm. The American people largely do not like politicians. The American people largely do not like Congress. You know, the polls come through, the Congress rates very lowly. But it seems like when there's a problem, there's a big percentage of the American people on health care or housing or gun laws or what have you, they immediately say government should do something. They don't trust the bureaucracy, they don't trust Washington, they don't trust Congress, but government should do something. How do you explain that paradox?
Well, I think that there's a temptation among all humans to want to live at the expense of somebody else. That is, the American people, and it's sad to say this, is that the American people love to live at the expense of somebody else. That is, whether it be farmers, they want the farm subsidies, poor people, food stamps, businesses, business bailouts. So if let's say in the case of a farmer, is the farmer's having trouble, and if he comes and puts a gun to me and say, give me your money, he's going to go to jail. But if he goes to Washington and gets a congressman to write a law enabling the IRS to take my money, he doesn't go to jail. So what people like to use government to do things that if they did the same thing, they would go to jail. So what I'm saying is that people like to use the government to legalize theft.
But you see how these pearls of wisdom, how this brilliance just flows. There's very few people who are capable of taking relatively complex subjects and reducing them down to relatively simple and understandable sentences. And that's why this man was so influential on so many of our lives. I don't believe there's a conservative in radio or TV today who wasn't influenced, and I mean significantly, by Walter Williams. And Walter Williams' reach through his columns and his books and substitute hosting for Rush Limbaugh. Remember that? He was tremendous. He was hilarious. Used to talk about his wife. Mrs. Williams wouldn't permit this, and Mrs. Williams, and then she passed away. That was his darling. You know, 2020 has really sucked. It has really been a terrible, terrible year. I'm just being honest. With this coronavirus, the effect on the economy, the disastrous potential outcome of the presidential election, the death of so many wonderful people. Walter Williams and I weren't like social buddies, but he was extremely influential. He was more than happy to come on the program, wasn't he, Mr. Producer? He was a happy warrior, and you always wanted to hear what he had to say.